Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Nevada. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1875. The silver boom that had drawn thousands to Nevada's harsh terrain had begun to wane. The Comstock lode, once yielding silver ore worth millions, had started showing signs of depletion. As mining towns emptied, those who remained were often individuals with nowhere else to go or those with reasons to remain hidden from the world. Virginia City, once a bustling metropolis of nearly 30,000 souls, was slowly contracting, its grand opera house and elaborate hotels standing as monuments to a prosperity that was gradually slipping away. It was during this period of transition that the events surrounding the Copper family first came to the attention of authorities in Story County. Nevada had achieved statehood just 11 years prior in 1864, and its legal institutions were still evolving from the rough frontier justice that had prevailed during the territorial period. Law enforcement was sparse, with vast areas remaining essentially ungoverned except for occasional visits from circuit-riding marshals. The isolated homestead stood approximately 17 miles northeast of Virginia City, nestled in a narrow valley where 6 Mile Canyon opens into the vastness of the high desert. The property occupied roughly 80 acres of land, including a modest stream that provided a rare, reliable water source in the arid landscape. According to county records from 1872, the property was purchased by Silas Copper, who claimed to be a former mining engineer seeking to establish a cattle operation. What raised initial suspicion among neighboring ranchers was not the family's reclusiveness. Isolation was common in the Nevada Territory, but rather the complete absence of cattle on a supposed cattle ranch. Barnett McCreary, whose own ranch bordered the Copper property to the south, noted in correspondence with his brother in Sacramento, "Our new neighbors claim to be ranchers, yet I've not seen a single head of cattle cross their land. They've constructed extensive outbuildings that serve no apparent agricultural purpose. When I inquired about their operation, Mr. Copper spoke vaguely of specialized breeding, yet would not elaborate further. I find myself uneasy in their presence, though I cannot articulate precisely why." The Copper family consisted of Silas, his wife Maribel, and his brother Ezekiel. According to immigration records at San Francisco, they had arrived from Europe in early 1871, though their exact country of origin was inconsistently recorded. One document lists Bavaria, another Vienna, suggesting movement throughout Central Europe before their arrival in America. Silas appeared to be in his mid-40s, with a meticulously trimmed beard that was prematurely gray. Contemporary accounts describe him as unfailingly polite, yet somehow distant, as if constantly distracted by thoughts he chose not to share. Maribel was significantly younger, perhaps no more than 30, with an intensity that many found unsettling. Unlike many women of the period, she actively participated in whatever business the family conducted, often handling complex negotiations that would typically be managed by male family members. Ezekiel, the youngest of the trio, presented the most conventional appearance. He was described as affable and engaging during the family's infrequent social interactions, often serving as the primary interface with merchants and officials. Yet those who knew the family noted that despite his apparently dominant social role, Ezekiel clearly deferred to his older brother in all matters of consequence. They kept entirely to themselves, making infrequent trips to Virginia City for supplies. Merchants noted that their purchases were peculiar: large quantities of salt, unusual metal implements, specialized glassware, and chemicals that had no apparent use in ranching or mining. They paid in cash, always in worn bills of small denomination that appeared to have been buried or hidden for some time. A ledger kept by Josiah Merrick, proprietor of Virginia City's largest general store, contains notations regarding the copper's purchases over a 2-year period. Mr. Copper again requested copper sulfate in quantity that exceeds any reasonable agricultural purpose, reads one entry from April 1874. When questioned, he stated it was for an experimental soil treatment. His manner was curt, and he offered no further explanation. I filled the order as requested, but have noted this unusual purchase. The ledger further records purchases of mercury, arsenic compounds, formaldehyde, and various acids, all in quantities suggesting industrial rather than domestic use. Of particular note were regular acquisitions of specialized electrical equipment, including Leyden jars, galvanic cells, and copper wiring, items typically associated with scientific research rather than agriculture. Other merchants reported similar interactions. Zebulon Parker, who operated the town's hardware store, recalled that Silas Copper once commissioned specialized metal containers with airtight seals, paying triple the usual rate for expedited completion. He provided drawings with precise measurements, Parker later testified. When I inquired about their purpose, he merely stated they were for specimen storage related to his agricultural experiments. There was something in his eyes that discouraged further questions. Parker's apprentice, a young man named Thaddeus Winters, later claimed that he had glimpsed the interior of one of these containers when it was returned for modification. The inside was lined with a strange material I couldn't identify, he stated in an affidavit given in 1876. It had a peculiar sheen to it, almost like the inside of an oyster shell, but with a coppery hue. When I asked Mr. Parker about it, he advised me to forget what I had seen and to avoid unnecessary conversation with the Copper family. The Territorial Enterprise, Virginia City's newspaper, makes only 2 mentions of the Coppers during their first years in the area. The first, from August 1872, simply notes their arrival among other new residents. The second, from January 1874, mentions Ezekiel Copper's attendance at a scientific lecture hosted by the Virginia City Athenaeum, a cultural institution that occasionally presented educational programs. The lecture topic was Recent Advances in Galvanic Preservation Techniques, presented by a visiting professor from San Francisco. The newspaper noted that Ezekiel posed several technically sophisticated questions that suggested considerable prior knowledge of the subject. The first official interaction with the property came in September of 1875, documented in a report filed by Deputy Marshal Jeremiah Wells. Responded to complaints regarding unusual odors emanating from the Copper property. Upon arrival, was greeted by Mr. Silas Copper at the boundary fence. He refused entry to the property, stating private business affairs were underway. The smell was indeed present, reminiscent of a slaughterhouse or tannery, though no livestock was visible on the premises. Mr. Copper produced documentation of a business license for experimental agriculture and insisted all activities were legitimate. The complaints had originated from travelers along the road that passed within a quarter mile of the Copper property. Several stagecoach drivers reported that passengers had become ill when passing this stretch, particularly on hot days when the air was still. One driver, Abner Hollister, described the odor as unlike anything in my experience, metallic yet organic, like blood mixed with copper pennies left in the sun. It clung to clothing and lingered in the nostrils for hours afterward. Wells noted in his report that while he had no legal grounds to force entry, something about the encounter left him profoundly disturbed. Mr. Copper maintained a smile throughout our conversation that never reached his eyes. His hands were stained a rusty brown color that he attributed to soil experiments. I departed without further incident, though I marked the case for follow-up. In personal correspondence discovered decades later, Wells confided to a colleague in Carson City, I have encountered murderers and claim jumpers who inspired less unease than this seemingly respectable man. His smile remained fixed, while his eyes assessed me with a coldness I cannot adequately describe. I found myself checking over my shoulder for the remainder of my ride back to town, unable to shake the sense that I had narrowly avoided some unspoken danger. Wells further noted that during his brief conversation with Silas Copper, he observed unusual activity at the main house. Though I was not permitted beyond the boundary fence, I glimpsed Mrs. Copper through a window, engaged in what appeared to be a laboratory procedure of some kind. She wore what looked like a surgeon's apron, deeply stained, and was manipulating equipment I could not identify from that distance. When she noticed my observation, she quickly drew a curtain across the window. Mr. Copper's manner became notably more tense after this moment, and he expedited the conclusion of our interaction. No official follow-up investigation occurred. The marshal's office in Virginia City was undermanned and overwhelmed with the typical crimes of a declining mining town: claim jumping, theft, assault, and occasional murder. A peculiar family conducting unusual but seemingly legal business on private property was not a priority. Marshal Everett Thornton, Wells's superior, annotated the deputy's report with a brief note. No clear legal violation. Monitor situation if additional complaints arise. Thornton was primarily concerned with maintaining order in Virginia City itself, as the economic decline led to increasing desperation among those who remained. The remote activities of an eccentric family were at best a secondary concern. During this period, a seasonal ranch hand named Prescott Chambers claimed to have observed unusual activities at the Copper property while tracking stray cattle that had wandered near the property line. In a statement given years later, Chambers described seeing a wagon arrive well after midnight, driven not by any of the Coppers, but by a man I didn't recognize. He and Mr. Silas Copper unloaded what appeared to be a large trunk, taking great care in its handling. They carried it into the barn rather than the house. The next morning I noticed the wagon was gone, but I never saw the driver depart. The timing of this observation corresponds with the disappearance of a drifter known only as Missouri Jack from Virginia City. Jack had been a fixture in local saloons for several weeks before vanishing in early August 1875. His absence was noted primarily because he had left behind a distinctive custom-made saddle at the livery stable where he had been boarding his horse. The saddle was eventually sold to cover his unpaid boarding fees. Chambers admitted he did not report this observation at the time, stating, "It wasn't my business what my neighbors did on their own property, especially at a time when many in the territory preferred their activities remain private." It was only after the later discoveries that I recalled this incident and recognized its possible significance. It wasn't until the disappearance of Adelaide Thornton in November of 1875 that attention returned to the Copper homestead. Mrs. Thornton, the widow of a moderately successful mine owner, had been traveling from Virginia City to Carson City when her carriage was found abandoned approximately 3 miles from the Copper property. The driver, a man named Winthrop Sullivan, was discovered nearly a mile away, disoriented and suffering from exposure. He claimed to have no memory of what had occurred after passing the road that led to the Copper homestead. Adelaide Thornton was not merely any widow, but the sister-in-law of Marshal Everett Thornton himself. She had been traveling to Carson City to finalize the sale of mining shares her late husband had held in the Consolidated Virginia Mine, a transaction that would have yielded a considerable sum. The financial documents she had been carrying were missing when the carriage was discovered, suggesting robbery as a possible motive. Sullivan's statement, preserved in the territorial records, describes the events leading to the disappearance. "We departed Virginia City at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Mrs. Thornton was in good spirits, having concluded business regarding her late husband's mining interests. The journey proceeded without incident until we approached the turnoff to the Copper property. I recall noticing a figure standing at the intersection, tall and motionless. I pointed this out to Mrs. Thornton, who instructed me to continue without stopping. After that, my memory fails. I have no recollection of what transpired until I was found wandering the next morning. In subsequent questioning, Sullivan was unable to provide a clear description of the figure he had seen, stating only that it had been wearing a long coat or possibly a robe, and had remained completely still as the carriage approached. When asked specifically if the figure resembled any of the Copper family members, Sullivan stated that he could not be certain, as he had never seen them at close range. Medical examination of Sullivan revealed no physical injuries beyond those consistent with exposure to the elements. However, Dr. Horace Gillespie, who conducted the examination, noted in his report, "Patient exhibits symptoms consistent with exposure to certain chemical compounds, including dilated pupils and respiratory irritation. These symptoms are not explained by environmental exposure alone and suggest contact with a foreign substance, possibly a vapor or gas with soporific properties." Gillespie further noted that Sullivan's memory loss appeared to be genuine rather than feigned. The patient demonstrates the confusion and distress typical of those suffering from true amnesia rather than malingering, he wrote. When pressed on details of the missing time period, he becomes agitated and experiences physical symptoms including elevated pulse and perspiration. It is my professional opinion that some agent, whether physical trauma or chemical influence, has indeed disrupted his memory formation during the period in question. The investigation that followed revealed a pattern that had gone unnoticed by authorities. Over the previous 18 months, 3 other travelers had disappeared along the same stretch of road. In each case, investigations had been cursory at best, as the missing were often individuals of little social standing. A Chinese laborer named Wei Jiang, who had been employed at the Consolidated Virginia Mine. A traveling salesman identified as Percival Hargrove, who represented a San Francisco textile firm, and a woman known as Ruby West, who worked in one of Virginia City's establishments of questionable reputation. Mrs. Thornton's social position, however, demanded a more thorough response. A review of territorial records revealed that Deputy Wells had taken statements regarding these disappearances, but had not identified any common factors linking them. The cases had been filed separately, and with no bodies discovered and minimal evidence available, they had received low priority. It was only when Marshal Thornton ordered a comprehensive review of all missing persons reports from the previous 2 years that the geographical pattern emerged. Marshal Jeremiah Wells, now acutely aware of the pattern centering around the road near the Copper property, assembled a search party of 8 men to investigate the area. The search party included deputies Frederick Mahler and Harrison Reed, as well as volunteers from Virginia City, including Sullivan, who insisted on participating despite his still weakened condition. The search covered rough terrain, focusing on ravines and abandoned mine shafts where a body might have been concealed. Unusually heavy autumn rains had eroded much of the landscape, exposing areas that had previously been inaccessible. The men worked in pairs, methodically surveying a 5-mile radius around the location where Sullivan had been found. On the second day of searching, one of the volunteers discovered a weathered leather bag half buried in a dry creek bed less than a mile from the Copper property line. The bag contained personal effects that were identified as belonging to Ruby West, the woman who had disappeared 3 months earlier. These items included a silver-backed hairbrush engraved with her initials and correspondence that established her identity beyond doubt. The location of the discovery was significant. It lay along a natural drainage route that originated near the Copper property. Heavy rains could have carried the bag from its original disposal site to where it was found. The condition of the items suggested they had been exposed to the elements for some time, consistent with the timeline of West's disappearance. In his journal, Deputy Mahler wrote, "The location of these items suggests they were deliberately discarded rather than dropped during a struggle or flight. The bag had been partially covered with rocks in a manner indicating human arrangement, rather than natural processes. This discovery transforms our understanding of the disappearances from isolated incidents to what appears to be a pattern of deliberate action. Further searching yielded additional evidence. A pocket watch identified as belonging to Percival Hargrove was found embedded in silt near the same creek bed. The watch had stopped at 7:42, presumably the time at which it had been submerged in water. Like the bag, its condition suggested prolonged exposure to the elements. With this evidence in hand, Marshal Wells determined there was now cause to inspect the copper property. He and 4 deputies approached the homestead on November 16, 1875. According to his official report, they found the gate unlocked and the house apparently abandoned. Signs indicated a hasty departure. Food remained on the table, doors stood open, and a wagon and horses were missing from the barn. The property consisted of a main house, a large barn, 2 outbuildings that appeared to serve as workshops, and a small bunkhouse that showed no signs of recent occupation. All structures were solidly built of locally quarried stone and timber, representing a significant investment. The construction suggested planning for permanence, making the abrupt abandonment all the more puzzling. What they discovered inside the main house defied immediate explanation. The front rooms appeared normal, if Spartan, typical of a frontier home. A parlor contained simple furniture, bookshelves filled with scientific volumes, and a writing desk with correspondence neatly arranged. The kitchen showed signs of regular use, with preserved foods properly stored and cooking equipment well maintained. However, the rear portion of the house had been converted into what Wells described as a workshop of the most disturbing nature. The walls were lined with shelves containing dozens of glass jars filled with unidentifiable substances. A large wooden table dominated the center of the room, deeply stained and fitted with leather restraints at each corner. Metal implements of unusual design were arranged on a nearby workbench. The purpose of this arrangement, Wells wrote, suggests procedures of an unnatural and possibly medical nature, though none of us present could identify a legitimate scientific or medical purpose for such a setup in a private residence, particularly one supposedly dedicated to agriculture or ranching. In testimony later given to territorial authorities, Deputy Harrison Reed provided additional details omitted from the official report. The stains upon the table were not merely the brown of dried blood, as might be expected in a butchering operation. They exhibited an unusual metallic quality, with areas that appeared almost to have a coppery sheen. Most disturbing were the restraints, which showed signs of recent use and had been constructed with considerable care and forethought. These were not improvised bindings, but purpose-built restraints designed for prolonged application. Reed further noted the presence of an elaborate drainage system built into the floor beneath the table. The flagstones had been precisely cut to create a gentle slope toward a central drain, and he stated, this drain connected to a copper pipe that led outside the building. The engineering involved suggested a significant investment of time and expertise, far beyond what would be necessary for typical ranch operations. Books found in this workshop area included medical texts in German and French, as well as more obscure volumes on anatomical preservation and electrical experimentation. Marginalia in these books, written in a precise hand identified later as belonging to Silas Copper, suggested years of careful study and practical application. One volume, Principles of Galvanic Preservation, by a Dr. Heinrich Stuber of Vienna, contained extensive annotations describing modifications to the techniques described in the text. The most significant discovery came when Deputy Frederick Mahler noticed that the dimensions of the house did not match its exterior appearance. A section of the western wall seemed thicker than necessary for structural purposes. Careful examination revealed a concealed door, skillfully integrated into the wooden paneling. The door led to a cellar that did not appear in any county building records. The space below was cool and dry, conditions that would have been difficult to achieve in the Nevada desert without considerable engineering knowledge. Stone walls had been reinforced with a substance that appeared to be a form of sealant, preventing moisture penetration. A ventilation system of copper pipes provided air circulation without compromising the controlled environment. The temperature, as measured by Deputy Reed, was a constant 58 degrees Fahrenheit despite the considerable heat outside. The cellar contained row upon row of sealed containers. Some were simple glass jars, while others were the custom-made metal containers that Silas Copper had commissioned from Zebulon Parker's hardware store. Most disturbing were several large glass vessels containing what appeared to be preserved human remains, though in a state that made identification impossible. The tissue had been altered through some unknown chemical process that left it with an uncanny copper-like sheen, a grotesque echo of the family name. The specimens, wrote Wells in a separate, confidential report that remained sealed until 1937, appeared to represent various stages of a process. In some containers, the tissue remained recognizably human, though altered in color and texture. In others, the transformation was more complete, rendering the original nature of the material almost unidentifiable. The most advanced specimens exhibited a flexibility and preservation that defied conventional understanding of tissue decomposition. Wells noted that the deputies who accompanied him were visibly shaken by the discovery. One man, a veteran of the Civil War who had witnessed the worst of battlefield carnage, became physically ill and had to be escorted outside. It was not the mere presence of human remains that caused such distress, Wells wrote, but rather the unnatural condition of the specimens, the sense that something had been done to them that violated fundamental natural processes. A leather-bound journal was discovered beneath a loose floorboard in the cellar. Written in Silas Copper's precise hand, it detailed experiments conducted over a period of nearly 3 years. The journal made frequent reference to perfecting the process and achieving permanent preservation. Most entries were clinically detached in tone, recording measurements, chemical formulations, and observations of tissue, changes over time. One entry, dated August 14, 1874, read, "Subject exhibits remarkable retention of tissue elasticity after 3 months in solution. The copper sulfate compound continues to show superior results compared to traditional preservatives." Ezekiel remains skeptical of the final phase, but his concerns are unwarranted. The integration will proceed as planned once sufficient material has been properly prepared. A later entry from February 1875 noted, "Maribel's suggestion regarding temperature regulation has proven invaluable. Maintaining the specimens at precisely 58 degrees Fahrenheit prevents degradation while allowing the catalytic process to continue unimpeded. She has shown unexpected aptitude for this work despite her initial reluctance. Her hands remain steady even during the most delicate procedures." The final entry in the journal, dated November 15, 1875, just 1 day before the officer's arrival, contained a troubling passage. "E. has betrayed us. His threat to contact authorities cannot be tolerated. M. agrees that immediate relocation is necessary. We shall take only the most advanced specimens. The remainder must be abandoned. The work is too close to completion to risk interference now." The last subject showed remarkable response to electrical stimulation, far beyond anything previously documented. "We stand at the threshold of achievement that will render conventional understanding of mortality obsolete." Marshal Wells confiscated the journal and all documentation found on the property. Much of this material was subsequently sealed by territorial authorities and has never been made public. However, excerpts from Wells's report provide disturbing insights. The documents suggest Mr. Copper and his associates believed they had discovered a method of preserving human tissue in a manner that maintained its flexibility and appearance indefinitely. The purpose of this preservation remains unclear, though references to the final integration suggest an ultimate goal beyond mere preservation. The technical nature of many passages indicates Mr. Copper possessed knowledge of chemistry and human anatomy well beyond what would be expected of a mining engineer or rancher. The search of the property continued for 3 days, yielding additional evidence with each passing hour. In the barn, a false wall concealed a second laboratory space, this one apparently dedicated to chemical production rather than the application processes conducted in the house. Large copper vats contained solutions in various stages of preparation. Detailed formulas were inscribed on a slate board, though these were recorded in a cipher that investigators were unable to immediately decode. A small office adjoining this space contained financial records suggesting the operation had been funded through a combination of personal resources and periodic infusions of capital from unknown sources. Correspondence with a banking house in San Francisco indicated regular transfers from accounts in Vienna and Zurich, though the specific individuals behind these transactions were not identified. Most concerning was a leather portfolio containing detailed information about each of the missing persons, including daily routines, travel schedules, and personal habits. This surveillance suggested the disappearances had been carefully planned rather than opportunistic. Adelaide Thornton's file was the most recent, containing notes about her planned journey to Carson City and the expected value of the financial transaction she had intended to complete. Behind the barn, investigators discovered a small cemetery containing 4 unmarked graves. Exhumation revealed these to be the remains of animals, 3 dogs and a horse, all showing signs of the same preservation technique applied to the human specimens found in the cellar. A notation in Copper's journal referred to these as early trials, suggesting they represented his initial experiments before moving on to human subjects. The investigation extended to the bunkhouse, which appeared to have been occupied intermittently by individuals other than the Copper family. Personal effects suggested at least 3 different occupants over time, none of whom had been registered as employees or associates in any official documentation. A trunk contained clothing of various sizes, including items matching the description of what Wei Jiang had been wearing at the time of his disappearance. A telegram was dispatched to law enforcement agencies throughout Nevada, California, and Utah, with descriptions of the Copper family members and their wagon. Despite an extensive search, no trace of them was found. Border authorities in California and Oregon were alerted, and ports along the Pacific coast placed under observation. The investigation eventually extended as far as San Francisco after reports suggested individuals matching their description had boarded a vessel bound for South America. But these leads proved inconclusive. In Virginia City, the discovery at the Copper homestead sparked widespread fear and speculation. The Territorial Enterprise, the local newspaper, published a heavily sanitized account of the investigation, describing it merely as a case of improper medical experimentation and possible connection to recent disappearances. Even this limited information was enough to cause considerable anxiety among residents, many of whom had traveled the road past the Copper property regularly without suspecting the horrors taking place nearby. Archibald Winthrop, editor of the Enterprise, later admitted that territorial officials had requested significant redactions to his original article. They claimed it was to prevent public panic, he wrote in his personal journal, but I suspect their concerns related more to the inexplicable nature of what was found. Some of what Marshall Wells described to me off the record defied rational explanation. I agreed to publish the sanitized version partly out of civic duty and partly because I feared being labeled a sensationalist if I reported the full account as it was related to me. The partial nature of the official disclosure led to rampant rumor and speculation. Saloon gossip transformed the Coppers into everything from foreign agents conducting espionage to practitioners of obscure European occult traditions. Some claimed the family had never existed at all, but were convenient scapegoats for murders committed by more prominent citizens. The lack of concrete information allowed these theories to proliferate unchecked. Territorial Governor Lewis Bradley received a comprehensive report on the investigation, but ordered most details restricted to a small circle of officials. In correspondence with federal authorities, Bradley wrote, "While the criminal nature of these activities is beyond dispute, certain aspects of the case suggest capabilities that, if verified and replicated, might hold significant interest for medical science or military application. I have therefore instructed Marshal Thornton to ensure that technical details of the preservation method are not disseminated to the public or press." The case took an unexpected turn in February of 1876 when a prospector named Jedediah Morse discovered a body in an abandoned mine shaft 20 miles from the Copper homestead. Morse had been exploring the shaft, which had been abandoned years earlier when its silver vein proved less productive than initially hoped in search of overlooked ore deposits. Instead, he found human remains partially concealed beneath a pile of rock. The remains were identified as those of Ezekiel Copper based on personal effects found with the body and physical description. The condition of the remains suggested he had died around the time of the family's disappearance from the homestead. A pocket watch found with the body had stopped at 10:17, presumably indicating the time of death. Most disturbing was the state of the body. The flesh had been subjected to the same preservation process documented in Silas Copper's journal. The cause of death was determined to be a single gunshot wound to the back of the head, executed at close range. No weapon was found in proximity to the body. Dr. Elias Montgomery, who conducted the examination of Ezekiel Copper's remains, noted, "The body exhibits minimal decomposition despite the estimated time of death being approximately 3 months prior to discovery. The flesh maintains a pliability that defies conventional understanding of post-mortem changes. Most notable is the distinct coppery hue and metallic quality of the tissue, particularly pronounced in areas with greater blood vessel concentration." Montgomery further observed that when small electrical charges were applied to muscle tissue during his examination, the muscles contracted in a manner reminiscent of a recently deceased body, rather than one that had been dead for months. This response to stimulation suggests that whatever process was used to preserve the tissue has maintained cellular integrity to a degree I would have previously considered impossible, he wrote. The scientific implications of such preservation, if it could be replicated under controlled conditions, would be profound. This discovery suggested a falling out among the family members, possibly related to their macabre research. The journal entry referring to Ezekiel's skepticism about the final phase took on new significance in light of his apparent murder. It also raised the possibility that Silas and Maribel Copper had not fled as far as initially believed. Local rumors persisted that they had simply established a new operation elsewhere in the vast, sparsely populated Nevada territory. Investigation of local property records revealed that Maribel Copper had purchased a small parcel of land near Pyramid Lake under her maiden name, Westfield, 6 months before the family's disappearance from the original homestead. A search party was dispatched to this location, but found the property undeveloped and no sign of recent human presence. The discovery of Ezekiel's body prompted renewed investigation into the family's background. Officials in Vienna, contacted through diplomatic channels, provided information suggesting that Silas Copper, under the name Siegfried Kupfer, had been associated with a research institute that had lost its university affiliation following allegations of ethical violations. The nature of these violations was not specified, but the institute had been primarily engaged in studies of tissue preservation and reanimation through electrical stimulation. In April of 1876, the territorial governor ordered the copper homestead burned to the ground, ostensibly as a public health measure. Critics later suggested this action was taken to destroy evidence of activities that officials preferred not to acknowledge or explain to the public. Whatever the motivation, the destruction was thorough. Today, nothing remains of the original structures. The fire burned for nearly 2 days, producing thick smoke with an unusual metallic odor that was reported as far away as Carson City. Several firefighters who attempted to control the blaze to prevent its spread to nearby vegetation reported respiratory distress and unusual symptoms, including disorientation and temporary vision disturbances. A physician who treated them noted similarities to the symptoms exhibited by Winthrop Sullivan following Adelaide Thornton's disappearance. The investigation into the missing travelers continued through 1876, but with the primary suspects gone and evidence destroyed, progress was minimal. Adelaide Thornton was never found, nor were any of the other missing persons. The case was officially closed in December 1876, with the notation, "Suspects deceased or fled jurisdiction. No further leads." Marshal Jeremiah Wells continued to pursue the case unofficially until his retirement in 1882. His personal papers, donated to the Nevada Historical Society after his death in 1890, reveal an obsession with locating Silas and Maribel Copper. "I cannot relinquish this pursuit," he wrote in 1878, "for I am convinced they continue their work elsewhere. The nature of their experiments suggests a purpose beyond mere academic curiosity, and I fear that whatever they intended by the final integration may yet come to pass if they remain at liberty." Wells followed leads as far as Denver and San Francisco, but never succeeded in locating the fugitives. His health declined precipitously in his later years, which he attributed to exposure to unknown chemicals during the investigation of the copper property. Medical records from his final years describe symptoms consistent with heavy metal poisoning, including neurological disturbances and renal failure. In a letter to Deputy Mahler written shortly before his death, Wells expressed continued concern about the case. "I am visited nightly by dreams of that cellar and its contents. What troubles me most is not what we found, but what we did not find, namely, any complete bodies of the missing persons. The specimens were extensive but fragmentary. This suggests a purpose for the preserved tissue beyond mere study. What Copper referred to as integration haunts my thoughts. I fear we interrupted a process whose full horror we can scarcely imagine." For nearly 80 years, the Copper case remained a disturbing footnote in Nevada's territorial history, occasionally mentioned in sensationalist newspaper articles or whispered about in Virginia city saloons. The story might have faded entirely from memory if not for a discovery made during highway construction in 1955. Workers expanding Route 341 northeast of Virginia City uncovered a previously unknown mine shaft that had been sealed with stones and timber. The shaft did not appear on any mining maps of the area and showed no external markers indicating its presence. When workers removed the sealing materials to assess the stability of the ground for road construction, they discovered a chamber that had been converted into what appeared to be a storage vault. The chamber walls had been lined with the same sealant observed in the copper cellar decades earlier, creating a controlled environment similar to that documented in the original investigation. Copper pipes provided ventilation, and drainage channels had been cut into the stone floor. The engineering suggested a direct connection to the methods employed at the homestead. Inside, authorities found human remains, 6 individuals in total, all in an unusual state of preservation. The tissue had the same distinctive copper-like quality described in the original case files. Based on personal effects found with the remains, one was identified as Adelaide Thornton. Others matched the descriptions of individuals who had disappeared in the vicinity of the copper property between 1873 and 1875, including Wei Zhang, Percival Hargrove, and Ruby West. Most disturbing was the arrangement of the bodies. They had not been simply stored, but positioned in a circular pattern around a central apparatus that appeared to be an early form of electrical generator. Copper wires ran from this device to metal contacts embedded in the preserved tissue, suggesting some form of ongoing experimentation. The generator's design was sophisticated for its era, incorporating principles that would not become standard in electrical engineering until decades later. The discovery prompted renewed interest in the copper case. Dr. Harlan Reichman, a pathologist from the University of Nevada, was granted permission to examine the preserved remains. His findings were published in a limited academic paper in 1957 titled Anomalous Tissue Preservation Observed in Human Remains from Virginia City Region. The paper was quickly classified and withdrawn from circulation after publication. According to individuals who claimed to have read Reichman's paper before its suppression, the preservation method used by the coppers involved a complex process combining chemical fixatives, metal salts, and a proprietary solution that Silas referred to in his journal only as the catalyst. The resulting preservation was remarkably effective. After 80 years, the tissue retained flexibility and showed minimal deterioration. The paper reportedly contained microscopic analysis of tissue samples showing cellular structures that had remained largely intact despite the passage of time. Conventional preservation methods of the 1870s would have caused significant cellular destruction, yet the copper technique had somehow maintained cellular integrity to a degree that defied explanation, even by 1950s standards. Most disturbing was Reichman's conclusion that certain samples showed evidence of continued cellular activity long after death should have rendered such processes impossible. He reportedly wrote, "The copper method appears to arrest decay while maintaining certain biological functions at a microscopic level. The implications of this finding are profoundly troubling and warrant further controlled study. The preserved tissues exhibit responses to electrical stimulation that suggest the persistence of cellular communication pathways, typically disrupted by death and subsequent decomposition." A colleague who assisted in Reichman's research later claimed that the tissue samples had demonstrated spontaneous microscopic contractions when exposed to electrical current, despite having been separated from any nervous system for nearly a century. This phenomenon had apparently been documented with time-lapse microphotography, though these images were among the materials seized when the paper was classified. No such study was ever publicly acknowledged. Reichman's career took an unexpected turn shortly after submitting his paper. He resigned his university position and accepted a research role with a private foundation that maintained no public presence. Attempts by journalists to contact him in later years were unsuccessful. His death was reported in 1965, attributed to complications from a laboratory accident, with no further details provided. A colleague of Reichman's, Dr. Vivian Mercer, later claimed in a private correspondence that Reichman had been approached by government representatives shortly after filing his report on the copper specimens. "They took a keen interest in his findings," she wrote. Harlan mentioned something about potential military applications for a preservation technique that maintained tissue viability. He seemed both excited by the scientific implications and disturbed by the ethical questions such applications would raise. After accepting the position with the foundation, he was never again forthcoming about his work. Mercer herself was subsequently offered a position with the same foundation, but declined, citing concerns about the secrecy surrounding its operations. Her academic career suffered unexplained setbacks in the years that followed, with research grants canceled and publications subjected to unusual levels of scrutiny. She eventually abandoned her work on tissue preservation entirely, focusing instead on conventional pathology. The remains discovered in 1955 were quickly removed by federal authorities, ostensibly for further forensic examination. No official report on these examinations was ever released. When questioned about the case in 1960, the FBI stated only that materials related to the Virginia City discoveries have been processed and archived according to standard procedure. Requests for information under early Freedom of Information statutes were consistently denied on grounds of national security. One such request, filed by the Nevada Historical Society in 1967, received the curious response that no records exist concerning the alleged discovery of preserved human remains in the Virginia City area. This directly contradicted newspaper accounts and statements from multiple witnesses to the discovery. What happened to Silas and Maribel Copper after their disappearance from the homestead remains unknown. However, in 1959, a librarian at the University of California, Berkeley discovered a series of scientific papers published in Argentina between 1877 and 1882 under the name S. cobra, the Spanish word for copper. These papers discussed theoretical approaches to tissue preservation using methods strikingly similar to those described in the confiscated copper journals. The papers appeared in obscure medical journals with limited circulation, suggesting a deliberate attempt to disseminate information while avoiding broader attention. They described a preservation method that maintained vital potential in organic tissue through a combination of chemical treatments and controlled electrical stimulation. The theoretical framework presented in these papers was reportedly decades ahead of contemporary understanding of cellular biology. The papers stopped abruptly in 1882. Argentine records show that a North American man matching Silas Copper's description died in Buenos Aires that year from what was reported as complications of chemical exposure. The death certificate, signed by a doctor, Emmanuel Vasquez, listed the cause as pulmonary failure secondary to inhalation of metallic compounds. The certificate also noted that the deceased had requested cremation rather than burial, an unusual preference in predominantly Catholic Argentina at that time. Further investigation revealed that Dr. Vasquez had been a student at the Vienna Medical School during the same period when Silas Copper, under his original name, had allegedly been associated with the controversial research institute there. This connection suggests a prior relationship that might explain why Copper chose Argentina as his destination after fleeing Nevada. No record exists of Maribel Copper's fate. However, a woman matching her description appears in photographs of faculty at a small private research institute in Córdoba, Argentina, as late as 1905. The institute, which specialized in experimental biology, closed in 1911 under circumstances that remain unclear. Local newspaper accounts from the time mention controversial research practices and ethical concerns but provide no specific details. Investigators who attempted to trace Maribel's activities after this period found only fragmentary evidence. A woman using the name Margaret Westfield appears in the records of a medical equipment supplier in Buenos Aires until 1917, purchasing items consistent with biological research. After this, the trail goes cold. Given her younger age compared to her husband, she could potentially have lived well into the 20th century. The Copper case presents a troubling picture of experimentation conducted without ethical constraints in the isolation of the American frontier. What motivated Silas Copper and his family remains a matter of speculation. Were they simply scientists working beyond the boundaries of conventional research, or was there a more sinister purpose to their efforts to preserve human tissue in a lifelike state? Some researchers have suggested connections between the Coppers and various 19th century scientific societies interested in extending human life or preserving consciousness beyond death. The period saw considerable interest in the boundaries between life and death, influenced by experiments like those of Luigi Galvani, who had demonstrated that electrical stimulation could cause movement in dead tissue. This animal electricity had sparked both legitimate scientific inquiry and more questionable pursuits. Silas Copper's background as a mining engineer provides limited explanation for his advanced knowledge of chemistry and human anatomy. Records examined after the case suggest he may have studied briefly at medical schools in both Philadelphia and Vienna before abandoning formal education, possibly due to ethical conflicts with his instructors. A journal belonging to Dr. Wilhelm Schneider, a professor at Vienna Medical School during the period Copper allegedly studied there, contains a reference to an American student with unorthodox theories regarding tissue preservation and vitality transfer. Schneider wrote, "While his technical aptitude is beyond question, his fixation on maintaining cellular function post-mortem suggests a concerning detachment from ethical considerations. His recent inquiries regarding nerve conductivity in deceased tissue have prompted me to recommend his dismissal from the program." Others have proposed more pragmatic motivations for the Copper's research, suggesting they were developing embalming techniques they hoped to patent and monetize. The late 19th century saw significant advances in mortuary science, and a truly effective preservation method would have had considerable commercial value. However, the secretive nature of their work and the apparent abductions that supplied their specimens suggest motives beyond commercial enterprise. The reference to integration in Copper's journals remains perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case. The term appears repeatedly, always in the context of a final phase that would represent the culmination of the preservation work. Some researchers have speculated that this might refer to an attempt to combine preserved tissues from multiple sources into a single functional entity, a concept more aligned with Gothic fiction than 19th century science, yet consistent with the evidence found at both the homestead and the mine shaft discovered in 1955. Professor Emeritus Dr. Lawrence Wayland of Stanford University, who studied the case extensively in the 1970s, before most records became restricted, proposed that the Copper's ultimate goal may have been to create what he termed a composite consciousness, a new entity formed from the preserved neural tissue of multiple individuals. While this sounds like the stuff of fiction, Wayland wrote, the arrangement of the bodies discovered in 1955, connected to a central electrical apparatus, suggests an attempt at some form of unified system rather than mere preservation. Perhaps most disturbing are the gaps in the official record, the classified reports, the missing evidence, the abrupt end to Reichmann's academic career. These suggest a concern about the Copper methods that extended beyond the obvious criminality of their actions. Something in the nature of their preservation technique prompted authorities to restrict information about it, even decades after the events themselves. Jeremiah Wells, in his final journal entry before his death in 1890, wrote, "I have come to believe that what I witnessed at the Copper homestead represents not merely a crime, but a fundamental transgression against nature itself. The boundary between life and death is not meant to be rendered permeable, yet this appears to have been Copper's ultimate objective. I go to my grave haunted by the thought that he may have achieved some measure of success in this unholy pursuit." In 1967, a graduate student researching frontier justice discovered a sealed packet of documents in the National Archives that had been misfiled among records from an unrelated case. The packet contained transcriptions of portions of Silas Copper's journal that had not been included in any previously available records. These fragments described what Copper referred to as the animation experiments, conducted in the months before the family's disappearance from the homestead. According to these notes, Copper claimed to have successfully induced localized muscular contractions in preserved tissue through the application of electrical currents, a finding not particularly remarkable in itself, as similar experiments had been conducted by legitimate researchers since Galvani's work in the late 18th century. What distinguished Copper's claim was the assertion that these responses increased in strength and complexity over time, rather than diminishing, as would be expected, in dead tissue. One fragment read, Day 137 of preservation. Specimen continues to exhibit enhanced response to stimulation. The modified tissue now demonstrates coordinated contractile patterns that suggest restoration of intercellular communication pathways. Maribel's refinement of the catalyst has proven transformative. We approach the threshold of reversibility. Another, more disturbing passage described what appeared to be experiments involving preserved neural tissue. The integration of cerebral matter from multiple sources presents unique challenges, yet preliminary results suggest viability. When stimulated according to the modified Schneider protocol, the composite exhibits electrical patterns reminiscent of autonomous function. Duration remains limited, 7 minutes in the most recent trial, but represents significant progress from earlier attempts. These documents were quickly reclassified and removed from public access. The graduate student who discovered them was questioned by federal authorities and reportedly advised to pursue other research interests. His dissertation on frontier justice systems was never completed, and he left academia the following year. In 1968, the last known document related to the case was archived and restricted from public access for 75 years. A clerk who briefly handled the file before its sealing reported that it contained a single photograph of a tissue sample taken from the 1955 discoveries. Written on the back in pencil was a single sentence, "After 80 years, still responsive to electrical stimulation." The implications of this statement, if accurate, defy conventional understanding of biological processes. No known preservation technique can maintain cellular viability for such an extended period. Yet the consistent descriptions of the copper method's results, from the original case files through to Reichmann's suppressed research, suggest something beyond standard embalming or preservation techniques. The road passing near the former copper property remains a working route today, now part of the improved highway system connecting Virginia City to the broader region. Local residents occasionally report an unusual metallic scent in the air when passing the area where the homestead once stood, particularly on hot summer evenings when the desert releases the day's heat. Highway patrol officers have documented an unusually high rate of inexplicable vehicle breakdowns along this stretch, often accompanied by reports of disorientation and temporary memory lapses among drivers. A study conducted by the Nevada Department of Transportation in 1972 found no environmental or geological factors that could explain these incidents. The report concluded that the statistical anomaly was likely due to reporting bias influenced by local folklore rather than any actual phenomenon. Despite this official dismissal, the stretch of highway continues to be known informally among locals as Copper's Mile, and many drivers choose alternative routes despite the added travel time. Electronic equipment reportedly malfunctions with unusual frequency in this area. A telecommunications company that attempted to install a relay station near the former copper property in 1987 abandoned the project after experiencing what an internal memo described as persistent and unexplained equipment failures. Environmental testing revealed elevated levels of copper and other metals in the soil, but not at concentrations typically associated with electronic interference. Amateur historians and paranormal enthusiasts have periodically attempted to locate the mine shaft where the preserved bodies were discovered in 1955. Road construction records should have documented the exact location, but these files were reportedly lost in a courthouse fire in 1963. Geological surveys of the area show numerous abandoned mining sites, making identification of the specific shaft nearly impossible without precise coordinates. In 1982, a group of geology students from the University of Nevada conducted soil samples along the highway where the copper property once stood. Their results, published in an obscure academic journal, noted unusually high concentrations of copper sulfate and other metallic compounds in a clearly delineated area corresponding to the property boundaries recorded in the 1870s county records. The contamination extended to a depth of at least 6 feet in the sampled areas and showed no significant reduction in concentration despite more than a century of exposure to weather and erosion. The student's professor, Dr. Calvin Morrison, noted that such persistence was unusual for water-soluble compounds in an area that, while arid, still received sufficient precipitation to typically leach such chemicals deeper into the soil or disperse them more widely. It's as if these compounds were somehow bound to the soil in a manner that resists normal environmental processes, he wrote. The chemical signature is distinctive and unlike typical mining contamination seen elsewhere in the region. Morrison's subsequent grant application for a more comprehensive study of the area was denied without explanation. University administrators later advised him to pursue other research interests, citing concerns about the scientific merit of the proposed study. Morrison eventually left academia entirely, accepting a position with a private environmental consulting firm. The Nevada State Historical Society maintains a small archival collection related to the copper case, though many documents remain restricted. Visitors to the collection have reported that the leather bindings of Silas Copper's journals, the only parts not sealed from public view, still carry a faint, distinctive odor. One archivist described it as the smell of old pennies and something organic, something that should have decayed long ago but somehow didn't. In 1990, a retired FBI agent named Morrison Caldwell self-published a memoir titled Buried Cases, a career in federal investigation, which included a chapter on the copper case. According to Caldwell, who claimed to have been part of the team that examined the 1955 discoveries, the preserved remains were transferred to a research facility in Maryland for analysis. What we found defied explanation within the scientific parameters of the time, he wrote. The tissue samples exhibited properties that blurred the established boundary between viable and non-viable biological material. Caldwell further claimed that electrical stimulation of the preserved tissue produced results consistent with the presence of autonomous function. He described a particularly disturbing incident in which a preserved nerve cluster, when subjected to a specific electrical frequency, exhibited what researchers interpreted as a pain response. This raised profound questions about the nature of consciousness and its persistence in preserved tissue, he wrote. If these samples could still experience pain after 8 decades, what other aspects of awareness might also persist? Most of the initial print run of Caldwell's book was purchased by a single corporate entity within weeks of publication. The publisher subsequently went out of business, and Caldwell died of an apparent heart attack before a second printing could be arranged. Surviving copies of the book command extraordinary prices among collectors of obscure historical works. In 2004, construction workers renovating a historic building in Buenos Aires that had once housed a research institute discovered a sealed room containing laboratory equipment dating to the late 19th century. Among the items recovered was a logbook with entries in English describing a preservation process using copper-based compounds. The final entry, dated January 14, 1882, read, "M insists we have achieved sufficient stability for transport. The integration phase will proceed as planned. After nearly a decade of preparation, the final convergence is at hand." The logbook also contained what appeared to be a formula for the catalyst referenced in Copper's Nevada journals. The formula included conventional chemical compounds, along with a substance identified only as extract of P. auris, with no further explanation. Margin notes suggested that this mysterious component was the key to the preservation method's unusual effectiveness. Argentine authorities turned the materials over to university researchers, but before analysis could begin, the items were reportedly stolen from the laboratory, where they were being stored. The theft remains unsolved, though investigators noted the highly selective nature of the crime. Only the materials from the sealed room were taken, despite the presence of much more valuable equipment in the same facility. Professor Elena Vasquez, the biochemist initially assigned to analyze the recovered materials, later claimed that she had managed to photograph several pages of the logbook before its theft. These images reportedly showed diagrams of a device designed to maintain electrical stimulation of preserved tissue over extended periods, a design strikingly similar to the apparatus found in the mine shaft near Virginia City in 1955. Vasquez submitted a paper describing her preliminary findings to the Journal of Historical Biochemistry, but it was rejected without review. She subsequently discovered that her university email had been accessed without authorization, and that the digital photographs of the logbook had been deleted from both her computer and all backup devices. When she attempted to pursue the matter, university administrators advised her to focus on her assigned research projects and avoid what they termed distractions of questionable scientific merit. The full truth of what occurred at the copper homestead in 1875 may never be known. What remains are fragments, a disturbing vision of scientific obsession unconstrained by ethics or oversight, a technique for preservation that defied contemporary understanding and the lingering question of what Silas Copper ultimately hoped to achieve through his forbidden practices. Perhaps it is better that some knowledge remains buried, some techniques lost to time. The case stands as a dark reminder of the dangers that can emerge when human ingenuity operates without moral compass, in places beyond the reach of oversight or accountability. In the vast spaces of the American West, such isolation allowed the Copper family to pursue their macabre work undisturbed, until the disappearances forced their activities into the light. As for the preserved remains discovered in 1955, their current location remains unknown. Official requests for information have been met with denials that such materials exist in government possession. Yet occasionally, researchers in specialized fields of tissue preservation or biological stasis report being approached by unnamed private foundations with unusual tissue samples that exhibit properties they cannot explain, samples with a distinctive copper-like sheen. Dr. Vivian Mercer, in her final interview before her death in 1978, made a cryptic statement regarding her former colleague Harlan Reichman and his work on the copper specimens. What troubled Harlan most wasn't the preservation itself, remarkable as it was, but what it suggested about our understanding of death as a definitive state. The copper method didn't just prevent decay, it maintained a potential that should have ceased with death. He once told me, "We've been asking the wrong question all along. The issue isn't whether consciousness can survive death, but whether what we call death is truly an endpoint at all." In 1987, a nursing home resident in Sacramento who claimed to be the granddaughter of Deputy Frederick Mahler told a local historian that her grandfather had removed a small specimen from the copper homestead during the initial investigation. He had kept this sample hidden throughout his life, preserved in a solution he periodically refreshed according to notes he had copied from Copper's journal. According to the woman, Mahler had been both fascinated and horrified by the specimen's resilience. "He told me it was just a small piece of tissue, smaller than a matchbook," she recalled, "but it never deteriorated. Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, he would apply a small electrical charge to it. He never told me what happened when he did this, but whatever he saw left him unable to sleep afterward." After Mahler's death in 1918, his wife allegedly destroyed the specimen and his notes, fearful of their implications. Whether this account is factual or merely the confused recollection of an elderly woman remains unverified, as no corroborating evidence has been discovered. The legacy of the Copper family endures, not just in fading documents and sealed archives, but in the unsettling possibility that their techniques did not die with them, that somewhere the knowledge they developed continues to be studied, refined, and perhaps applied in ways Silas Copper himself never imagined. In Virginia City, older residents still avoid discussing the Copper case. When pressed, they often respond with the same phrase: "Some things should stay buried in the desert." Whether they refer to the family's victims, their techniques, or some deeper truth about the case remains unclear. What is certain is that in the vast, open spaces of Nevada, secrets can remain hidden for generations, preserved like the Copper specimens, in a state that is neither fully dead nor truly forgotten. A final note appears in the restricted files, reportedly added in 1962 by a federal investigator who had tracked references to the Copper preservation technique for over a decade. It reads simply, "The method works. The question we should be asking is not how, but why. What purpose could justify preserving human tissue in a state that is not quite dead? And who might benefit from such knowledge today?" That question remains unanswered. The winds continue to sweep across the Nevada desert, erasing footprints and weathering away the remnants of the past. But beneath the surface, some things remain preserved, waiting perhaps to be rediscovered. In 1994, a retired archivist from the Nevada Historical Society claimed in an anonymous letter to the Reno Gazette-Journal that certain documents related to the Copper case had been systematically removed from public collections by government representatives during the 1960s. They weren't interested in the criminal aspects of the case, the letter stated. Their focus was entirely on the preservation technique and its potential applications. When I asked what agency they represented, they produced credentials I didn't recognize and merely said they were acting in the interest of national security. The newspaper investigated, but found no officials willing to confirm or deny the archivist's account. A Freedom of Information Act request regarding government interest in the Copper case was met with a response that no records responsive to your request exist within FBI or Department of Defense archives. Today, the area where the Copper homestead once stood is indistinguishable from the surrounding desert landscape. No marker indicates the site of what may have been one of the most disturbing scientific endeavors of the American frontier era. Yet something of the story persists in local memory, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale about the dangers that can hide behind seemingly respectable facades and the horrors that can unfold when human experimentation proceeds unchecked by ethical constraints or oversight. For those who have studied the case most deeply, what remains most disturbing is not what is known about the Coppers and their work, but what remains hidden, sealed in government archives, buried in forgotten mine shafts, or preserved in private collections beyond public scrutiny. The boundary between scientific advancement and forbidden knowledge is rarely clear, particularly in retrospect, but the Copper case suggests that some lines, once crossed, leave marks that endure far beyond the lifespan of those who transgressed them. The desert keeps its secrets well, but even in Nevada's vast expanses, nothing remains buried forever. The Copper legacy waits, preserved in fragments, for someone to reassemble the pieces and perhaps finally understand the true purpose behind their macabre work, the ultimate goal of what Silas Copper called the final integration